would the Democrats stick up for the middle class and fight back for them?
Well, the issue is a pretty clear issue. What the Republicans want to do is throw hundreds of thousands of kids off Head Start. They want to substantially cut back on Pell Grants, which will impact millions of college students. They want to cut back on heating assistance programs. They want to cut back on pregnancy prevention programs, etc., etc. This is a real vicious attack. What the Republican budget in Washington is against working families and low-income people. Meanwhile, the top 1% are doing phenomenally well. Their effective tax rate at 16% is lower than at any time in recorded history. They have gotten hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks. In my view, instead of attacking the middle class and working families, you've got to ask the wealthy to start paying their fair share of taxes. If we simply do a 5% surtax on all income over $1 million, you can cover all of the cuts that the Republicans have put into their budget. You don't have to cut back on children, the sick, the elderly, or the poor. Ask the people earning more than $1 million to pay a 5% surtax on income above $1 million. Go after the oil companies who have loophole after loophole. You do those things, you don't need any of the cuts that the Republicans are talking about.
Well, Governor Rendell, will the National Democratic Party have the courage to do that? Will they say, hey, you know what, let's put a surtax on the people making over $1 million, let's end the oil subsidies, and let's fight for it? Let's not go, oh, we tried, oh, well, look at that, the Republicans won again.
Well, I think so. I think the polls are fairly overwhelming now after Wisconsin, and I think Wisconsin has been a catalyst. And I think the National Democrats should pivot and, number one, do what Bernie said, close the loopholes, first of all. There's nobody out there who thinks that the loopholes make sense. Nobody thinks that corporations should be able to shelter their income from taxes because they invest abroad. Let's close those loopholes. Let's take away the subsidies from the Exxons and the oil companies that are making unbelievable record profits. Virtually every American agrees on that, Republican or Democrat. So those are things that I think are easy to do, and we should do it, and we should speak up. And I do believe, I disagree with Bernie slightly, I think we do have to cut some programs. We certainly ought to cut a lot of military spending, wasteful spending that Secretary Gates has indicated is unnecessary. And there is some waste in social programs. And you don't go after LIHEAP, the heating assistance for low-income people. You don't go after education, but you try to trim those programs that aren't reaching their mark. You've got to do a little of both. The key for us is to say there's got to be shared sacrifice, because right now, Cenk, the sacrifice is all one-sided. It's on working families and on the working poor as well.
Well, I want to come back to that in a second, but you mentioned something very interesting. You said, Governor Rendell, nobody believes that, but they actually just had a vote on it in Congress, and the Republicans won on the loopholes. They voted to keep the loopholes for the oil companies. So why don't you guys call them out on it? I mean, the Republicans are vicious to Democrats. Why don't the Democrats come out and say these Republicans are bought, lock, stock, and barrel by the oil companies? They're sold out.
If I can jump in before Bernie, I know he wants to be heard in this. I think that's the mistake we made in the 2010 election. We ran tried to be Republican light, and everywhere we tried to do that, we lost. We should have stood up for the things we believed in and told the people the absolute truth. And then, if we lose, at least we lost fighting for things that we believe in, that are our core principles. And it's time for us to go back to the core principles, what made us Democrats, and stand up and put those before the voters. Don't try to be imitation Republicans.
All right, now, Senator Sanders, look, I want to go to that point, right? If, and Governor Rendell mentioned it, if there was a deal and they said, hey, we're going to cut spending a little bit, but we're going to also raise taxes a little bit, maybe your surtax idea, would you go for that? Is that a possibility? And is that even possible that they would suggest that in Washington?
Sure. Governor Rendell is right. There is waste in government, and I didn't mean to suggest that we can't make judicious cuts in a number of areas, certainly including the military, whose budget has almost tripled since 1997. So I do think you need to make some cuts. But on the other hand, when the wealthiest people are becoming wealthier, paying very low effective tax rates, have received huge amounts of tax breaks, they have got to participate in the effort to lower this deficit. It cannot simply be on the backs of the weak and the vulnerable.
Well, let me stay with you, Senator Sanders. What is going wrong here in Washington? Because what we had was an immediate $800 billion tax cut There was really almost no fight over that. They got that right away. Now, when you go to do balance the budget, they say you can only do spending cuts, only spending cuts. So you've already lost, because now we're arguing, Democrats and Republicans are arguing over the size of the spending cuts. Why do the Democrats lose that framing battle every single time? I want to ask both of you. Senator Sanders, you start.
Well, I think, look, I was on the floor of the Senate for 8.5 hours talking about those issues. And I think that the problem is that big money has just a huge impact on both political parties. And I think it's fair to say that many Democrats have lost their way and no longer see their function as representing working people or the middle class, but share the goal of the Republicans, unfortunately, in representing the wealthy and the powerful.
See, that's an interesting indictment of some Democrats, and I think I totally agree with that. Governor Rendell, what do you think?
I agree with Bernie as well. I think some people in our party have forgotten about their roots and forgotten what we're fighting for and forgotten fundamental fairness. Look, this interim budget battle and the long-term battle over the president's budget next year are going to be very, very telling. And it is my hope that every Democratic senator in the Senate, of course, including independent Senator Sanders, will stand up and say, hey, don't even talk to us about tax cuts when you're giving subsidies to the oil companies. Don't even talk to us about, spending cuts when you're not closing loopholes that are so unfair. Talk about those things, then we can maybe do this interim budget. And then next year, let's go back to taking away the Bush tax cut for the top 2% in this country, because it's fair, the people support it across the board.
You know, I hope that the White House is listening to you guys. I hope that they come out and go, hey, wait a minute, nobody likes those. The real Americans. Governor Rendell's right. Senator Sanders is right. If we're going to do the spending cuts, you've at least got to give us back these subsidies that we're giving to the largest oil companies in the world.
It's ridiculous, ridiculous.
Absolutely.
The only thing that I would add to what Ed said, and I agree with everything that he said, is the Republican proposal in the midst of a horrendous recession with unemployment extraordinarily high will cut hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Wow. And you know, that's not theory. If I can jump in, Cenk, that's not theory. Remember this past month's job report, 222,000 public sector jobs created. That's great news. The net was 192,000 because we lost 30,000 public sector jobs. That is just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg of what we're going to lose when these budget cuts go through, not only in Washington, but in state capitals alike. We're going to lose hundreds of thousands of public employee jobs.
All right, Senator Sanders, Governor Rendell, thank you both very much for joining us this evening.